My name is David Cohen, and I own a law firm that specializes in helping dentists with their legal, business, transactional needs. And the main thing that I help doctors with is practice transition. I help doctors buy and sell practices. And I do about 200 practice transitions per year nationwide. So it's something that I'm dealing with on a daily basis, and I'm seeing a lot of different things out there. And so what I've come to learn over time is that a lot of the doctors that have been clients of mine that I've seen in other deals, and I've actually been a client of lawyers before in selling a business, you come to understand that the legal documents are very hard to understand sometimes. And the legalese, it can put you to sleep, and it's just really hard to understand. And so what I've done is I've created a presentation that's called, practice transitions in plain English. And really, I have three main goals for you today in this lecture. Number one is to save you time. Number two is to save you money. And number three is to save you headaches. So time, money, and headaches, really just three main goals. And I think through taking you through my presentation of practice transitions in plain English and taking you through some of the case studies that I have for you, I think it's going to help you save time, money, and headaches as you go into your transition, because you're going to understand more of what you're getting into and what the documents say and what questions to ask, who to ask them to, and when to ask them. I'm not expecting you to understand absolutely everything in a legal agreement. That's what us lawyers are here for. But I think it's really critical for you to go into your practice transitions and have a basic, fundamental, foundational understanding of what you're getting into, again, so you can save time, money, and headaches. And there can be a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of headaches involved in a transition if you don't go about it the right way, you don't get the right team involved in your corner, and you don't really understand what's going on. So, the first thing that we do is let's kill all the lawyers. Obviously, that's a quote, Henry VI, and it's very true. I mean, lawyers get a bad reputation for creating words that aren't even in the dictionary, that nobody understands. And I think it's almost like a rite of passage when you become a lawyer, that you have to create things that everybody else doesn't understand so that you can feel like you're superior or you're cooler to everybody. And for me, that's something that I don't enjoy very much, because I'm on transactions with lawyers all the time. They're on the other side of my deals, every single deal that I do, or almost every time, and you'll hear about that more later. But the point is that this is something that's a problem in the legal field, and I personally strive with my firm to change that, to really create contracts and create relationships with clients so they better understand what they're getting into. So to break this down, there are three phases of transition, okay? You've got your associate phase, you've got your purchase and sale phase, and you've got your partnership phase, okay? So those are the three phases of a transition. And in these three phases, I'm going to walk you through some of the key steps in some case studies so that you better understand each of the key phases and what you're getting into. So the first phase that we're going to talk about is the associate phase. Why are we going to talk about that phase first? We talk about it first because a transition is a cycle. In a typical transition, the associate associates in the practice, they buy into the practice and become a partner. Then they buy out the existing doctors eventually in the practice, who then maybe become associates for that initial associate. And it's almost like a cycle, okay? So that's why we start with the associate phase. And there are really two primary goals to the associate phase, okay? It's number one, have an agreement, and number two, protect your time, your money, and your investment, okay? So let's first talk about having an agreement. Why does that sound so fundamental and so easy, but yet it's something that, believe it or not, many doctors do not have. I can't tell you how many times I get calls from doctors needing help, and I have to tell them, well, really, the legal agreement is going to be what governs what happens here. And they tell me, well, I don't have a legal agreement. And so then there's a lot of ambiguity in the deal because we don't even have an agreement to look at. So why is it important to have an agreement? It's important to have an agreement because you want to govern the material points of your associateship phase with your associate. You want to govern what their pay is, when they get paid. You want to govern confidentiality. You want to govern a non-compete, which I will get to, where depending on what state you're in and its enforceability requirements, in most states, non-competes are enforceable as long as they comply with the law, with the laws and standards of that state. That allows you to have that non-compete. It allows you to set certain protocols and standards of expectations that you have for the associate. So those are really key items that you want to outline and make sure that you have that agreement in place. You also want termination protocols of when the parties can terminate one another. Most states are at-will states, but the contract typically would govern over at-will employment. So for instance, if you've got an associate working for you and you're in an at-will state, if you have an employment agreement that says no party can terminate for 60 days, without 60 days notice, that's going to govern over a law that says, anybody can terminate at any time. Typically, that law, what's in your contract, would trump whatever is the sort of default with the law of the state. So that's really critical for you to know. Now, protecting your time, money, and investment is the second goal of this associate agreement. And why is it so important that this associate agreement protects this investment, this practice that you have? Well, it does because what your associate does for you can actually impact a buyer of your practice if that associate's not going to be the buyer of your practice. And what I mean by that is if you have a non-compete in your contract in a state where that's enforceable, you're going to be able to create a clause that says this contract is assignable to a third-party purchaser of your practice. And that helps you preserve your investment so that you can transfer the contract of your associate and the commitments and non-competes and all that come with it to the buyer of the practice. It keeps your practice as marketable as possible, because what a buyer doesn't want is to come in, want to buy your practice, find out that the associate you have in your office doesn't have a contract or doesn't have a non-compete or doesn't have an assignable contract. They may have a contract, they may have a non-compete, but the contract may not be assignable, right? So it's really critical that you have an assignability clause in that contract so that the buyer can know that you're transferring the non-compete and all the elements of this agreement over to them, and that they're not going to buy a practice and have an associate open up right next door to them and tarnish the goodwill that they're buying. Now, obviously, associates can have different impacts in practices. Some associates run the whole practice. It's an investment practice for a doctor, and literally that associate has mostly all of the goodwill in the practice. Those are the ones that really you need that assignability and et cetera with respect to the contract and the non-compete. You've also got associates who maybe mean a little bit less, but at the end of the day, you don't want to take your chances. You don't know what a buyer is going to be particularly, looking for. So it's important to make sure you preserve your investment. I've also seen buyers from time to time want to decrease the price based on the fact that there's no contract with an associate. And furthermore, it's good for the associate too. The associate, if they're getting their contract assigned to the buyer, they know that they still have a job when that transition happens. So to me, it kind of grows the pie and creates a win-win scenario. So associateship phase case study number one that I want to take you through is the good old handshake. This is a client that I had who ran into that exact problem that I just talked about. They did not have an agreement, and they said that they could just do everything based on a handshake. And I have to say, those relationships can go south very quickly. In this case, it actually did not go south, but they called me and said that they wanted to transition their practice. They wanted to sell it. And this associate that was working for them meant a lot. And unfortunately, they had a hard time selling their practice because the associate, after not having any contract, certainly did not want to sign a new contract. They didn't have any incentive to sign a new contract. So when the buyer came in and asked if the associate had a contract, the seller had to tell them, no, we don't. And then the buyer became concerned that the associate could compete with them. And the buyer ended up the client had to pay the associate a significant sum of money. It was $50,000 so that they would sign off on a non-compete that was assignable that preserved the integrity and value of the practice. And the buyer was then willing to purchase. And this was in a smaller town and there weren't a lot of buyers out there. So it was really important for the seller that they got this done. And unfortunately, it came at a significant cost. Now, the cost still made it worth doing the deal to that particular seller, but you never know, it may not. And that was a significant issue. And all they could have done, what they could have done is paid money to get a contract drafted, which would have paled in comparison to the cost that they had to pay the associate in terms of getting that contract signed. And they didn't do that. So it was a small cost to pay to prevent a huge cost later on that they did not do. So have an agreement is really critical. And again, even if a non-compete is not enforceable in the state that you're in, and again, most states they are, it's still important to have that contract because there are other covenants in the agreement that are important to preserve, such as confidentiality, et cetera. Associate case study number 2 is having skin in the game, okay? So I had a client one time, and I say one time only because it was pretty recent, but this has happened several times throughout the course of my career, but one time, because this is the situation that I'm alluding to, they had a situation where they were getting associates in, they would kind of rev themselves up and train the associates and be ready for those associates to buy in, and that would help contribute to their retirement plan. And what ended up happening was these associates kept leaving for other opportunities. Now, they probably could have done a better job vetting out the associates to begin with to make sure that they were going to be a good fit and that they were going to follow through and purchase the practice. But the reality is they were having a really hard time keeping associates committed because every single time they seemed to have an associate that was ready to go and to create a plan to buy them out, they would leave them. And so what I suggested to this particular doctor was that they create a scenario where the associate put some skin in the game, meaning they would come in, they would get paid based on whatever the pay structure was in the deal, but they would also allocate a portion of that pay toward an escrow account where if the associate left and did not buy in, they would lose that money and the practice would be able to retain that money. So that was a solution where they made the associate put some skin in the game. They had some money put up in escrow and they would lose that money if they didn't end up buying in. Now, we did have to add some language saying that if my client were to terminate the associate, that money would be returned back to the associate. And that was the fair thing to do. But the point is, really have the associate consider putting some skin in the game, because not only does it sort of compel the buyout, but it also creates a scenario where you know they're serious about joining your practice, because often associates aren't going to be willing to put up money that they could lose if they're not really serious about the opportunity. So we've talked about the associateship phase, and now we're going to go on to the purchase and sale phase. And with the purchase and sale phase, there's really one primary goal that I want to take you through, and that is to tell your complete story. The purchase phase is governed primarily by an asset purchase agreement, because mostly every practice sale is an asset sale, okay? And this asset purchase agreement is the agreement that tells the complete story of how the transition is going to occur. There are other documents that are ancillary to the asset purchase agreement, such as a bill of sale, and those documents are important. And for instance, the bill of sale is actually the document that transfers the assets from seller to buyer. It's a short document, it may be a paragraph or two, but it means a lot, and it's actually to transfer the assets, but it doesn't tell any of the story. And it's really critical for you to tell your story in that asset purchase agreement. And the first thing that you want to do in an asset purchase agreement is identify the assets that are being sold and the assets that are not being sold. I know this sounds really elementary, but that's what this lecture is all about, because unfortunately, even the most elementary things in these transitions are failed to be followed, okay? So this particular situation, I had a call one day from a client that said, hey, I bought a practice and I'm starting to operate the practice. I just bought it and the seller has been coming in all this first week and they're starting to take paintings off the wall. They've taken some furniture out of the office in the waiting room. And I don't know what's going on here. And obviously that's completely disruptive to my practice. So I said to them, as I always do, well, your contract is going to govern that. Well, they did have a contract and they showed me the contract and the contract was vague. And so the best way for them to have avoided vagueness and ambiguity was to describe exactly the assets that were sold and those that were not. And what they didn't do is identify whose property that artwork was and whose property the furniture in the waiting room were, right? So what they should have done is create a list of excluded assets in the deal where the seller would be able to identify exactly what assets are excluded from the deal. And they should have had a comprehensive list of the assets, an actual inventory that lists all of the inventory, all the assets that are being purchased in the deal. And they didn't. The document spoke in generality, and also the excluded asset list had not much on there, right? And so and then I had to look furthermore to see, okay, did the contract say all assets are included unless they are excluded? Because that would have at least been clear that the buyer gets everything unless it's specifically excluded. Or does the contract say that essentially the buyer's only getting the assets that are described, right? And so in their deal, actually it was pretty vague and it was hard to understand what was going on. So we have this dilemma of the artwork being taken out of the office. Not only did the buyer think that they were getting that, but it was also a very disruptive thing. And they also had this issue with the furniture being taken out. Now, the good news was they came to an amicable solution. And I'll talk about amicable solutions later when I go through the partnership phase. But they were able to come to an amicable solution where the buyer got to keep that artwork and the furniture for a certain period of time. And that gave them time to sort of flip themselves and get their own stuff. And it wasn't that they were opposed to getting their own stuff. It was really just that they needed something in there. And it was a pretty rude awakening for it to be taken out and with no sort of lead time. So managing expectations is really critical to identify what's being sold and what is not. Another area of this story that needs to be told is whether accounts receivable is being sold and whether it's not being sold, okay? And I'd say in the deals that I'm doing, probably about half the time the AR is sold and half the time it is not. It used to be more of a rarity, I would say, that AR would be sold, but it's becoming more common. And really, whether the AR is sold or not is something that's a business decision of the parties in the deal that you should talk to your teams about. But I had a situation that needed to be managed, and it really wasn't governed in the agreement properly when they were telling their story. And that was that the AR was not being sold in this particular transaction. And as a result, the seller was responsible to come in and collect their AR. And the buyer had a clause in the contract saying they would assist, but they would only assist if they got a fee of 5% of the amounts that they collected to do so, because they would be exercising time and money essentially by having their staff to help the collection and bill out all the AR, et cetera. So what ended up happening was the seller really wanted to save on the 5% fee. And what ended up happening was they were coming into the office almost every single day, being a real nuisance to the buyer when they were trying to operate their practice and causing headaches all over the place. And they were going into files that they shouldn't have been going into. And it was really difficult. And to make things a little bit worse, that seller was still directing staff to do or to refrain from doing certain things. And it really wasn't their place to tell the staff things anymore because they didn't own the practice, but the staff didn't really know much differently. So it became a really big issue. And so what I had to come in and do is kind of look at, okay, well, what's going on with the contract? What did it govern as far as collection of that AR? How often can the seller come in to help himself get that AR? And under what circumstances? And do they have to be reasonable? Is it during business hours? Is it not during business hours? Those are things that are really important to be outlined in the contract thoroughly if AR is not going to be purchased. Because again, time, money, and headaches, if there's some ambiguity there, and really it's not good for anybody. It's not good for the seller because they're obviously going to be in a tough spot, not getting the AR access as much as they would like to. And it's tough for a buyer because the buyer has the seller coming in, disrupting operations. The third case study I'm going to call the one-person show. And the lesson here is to delegate to your teammates. The one-person show is all about having a team to surround, okay? So when you're buying or selling a practice, team is critical. It's your lawyer, it's a CPA, it's if you're on the buyer side, a lender, an insurance agent, etc. These are a broker, brokers, consultants. These are all great members of teams. And I can't tell you how many times I see doctors out there trying to save money by not hiring members on their team. And it's really critical to hire members of the team for two main reasons. The first reason is that doctor probably doesn't have the expertise to be able to weigh in every facet and every capacity that they need for the deal. And number two, even if they did have the expertise, there are some dentists out there who are also lawyers or CPAs. It doesn't mean they have the time to afford to do it properly. And what ends up happening is not only do they cause an impediment for themselves, but they also make the transaction much more difficult for everybody else involved. And what happens when the transaction is more difficult for everybody else involved? The transaction ends up having a lesser of a chance of closing. And that's not good for anybody. Why? Because that's time, money, and headaches if the deal doesn't close. You wasted your time, you wasted stress. That's not for anybody. It's really critical to hire a team around. I apologize to everybody. I don't know. It was one of those things where right before I started, I'm like, it's never cut out before internet-wise, and I felt good about it. And unfortunately, it seems like that's what happened. But I am getting right back to it, and I appreciate everybody hanging in there. So I believe we were on case study number 4. We had just finished talking about the one-person show and making sure that you delegate to your teammates. And I was just starting to talk about case study number 4. So again, sincere apologies to everybody, and I'm just glad that we're back rolling here. So purchase and sale case study number 4 is the breached promise. And what I mean by the breach promise is in a purchase agreement, to recap, we talk about what assets are being sold and what assets are not being sold. And we talk about the AR and the purchase price and elements like that. And we make sure we have our team surrounding us. We then move on and talk about what promises we're making to each other, purchaser to seller, seller to purchaser. And these are called representations and warranties. Representations and warranties are promises the parties are making to one another. And there are usually about 15 or 20 of these that the seller makes to the buyer in the deal. And there are usually 5 to 10 that the purchaser is making to the seller in the deal. It's really critical that you have these in the transaction, particularly if you're a buyer, because you want to make sure that the seller is promising several things about the practice that they're selling you. And it's also important for a seller to make sure that the buyer is promising certain things to you, such as them having the authority to enter the deal, that they're licensed to practice dentistry in the state that they're doing the deal in, that they don't have any conflicts that prevent them from doing the deal. Those are examples of promises and reps and warranties that a buyer makes to a seller. But on the seller side, what they need to make to a buyer that the financials are true and accurate, that the assets they're selling are free and clear from all liens, liabilities, and encumbrances, that they have no employment claims against them, for example, and that they've paid out all their accrued vacation time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important that you have all these promises about the deal. Well, I was once in a situation where I was representing some clients that purchased a practice, and we made sure, and the seller was somewhat reluctant, we made sure that the seller warrant that the financials were true and accurate. And so what ended up happening was the purchaser bought the practice, and a month or two later, my client seemed to find out that the financials that were provided to them were not actually true and accurate. And it was really critical because we had that representation and warranty, that promise in the contract, which mandated that the seller promised that the financials are true and accurate. And this is something that's critical, for example, because the financials that you're given at closing as a buyer might look like they make sense, but if they're not accurate, you as a buyer have no way to know that they're not accurate until you start digging into things and you bought the practice, or you realize the income that's coming in isn't the same as was promised to you, and all that kind of stuff. So it's really important that you hold your sellers and your buyers on either side accountable, and that you have these reps and warranties in your transaction. Purchase and sale case study number 5 are contingencies. These are carving out things in the deal where you can sign your contract, but the deal still doesn't happen unless certain things occur, okay? And why is this important? Because everybody wants to sign their purchase and sale agreement as soon as they possibly can. A buyer probably needs it for their lender. A seller is going to need it because they want to know that they have a deal. And a buyer also wants to know that they have a deal as well. So everybody wants to sign the agreement as soon as they can get it agreed to. So for instance, if you're entering into a transaction that doesn't close till October 31st, 2021, but you're materially there on your contract as of now, because you always want to try to be proactive and get things done in advance, well, you'd still probably want to sign your contract so that you know you have a deal. And how do you do that when you're a month away and you don't know what's going to happen between now and a month? So you'd want to put some contingencies in your agreement where, of course, nobody intends to back out of the deal, but they would be able to back out of the deal if these things don't occur. So for instance, for a buyer, you'd want to have a financing contingency that says, sure, I'll sign this contract, but if my bank doesn't loan money to me, well, I'm going to have to be back out of this deal. Now, some sellers in that situation might want to strike the contingency because if you've gotten a loan approval, they may say that's good enough. But for a buyer, I still think it's important to have that financing contingency in the agreement because you never know what's going to happen. I can't tell you how many people didn't get loans when COVID hit. This was in early 2020. A lot of doctors were guaranteed loans through financing commitments, but then when the deal came and COVID hit, a lot of lenders were not able to at that time. And understandably so, right when it hit and no one knew what was going on. So the point being, financing contingencies are really big for a buyer. That's one example. Another contingency that's important for both buyer and seller is a lease contingency, if the building's being leased, or a building purchase contingency if the building's being purchased. These are contingencies where if a satisfactory lease is not entered into, there's no deal. Of course, if you're a seller that owns a building, you don't want to sell a practice and then not have anybody leasing your building. And if you're a buyer, you certainly don't want to buy a practice and have nowhere to practice it because you don't have a lease, and so forth. So the point being, it's really important to carve out these contingencies, those being the most important, but there's also smaller contingencies that still could have an effect, such as that those reps and warranties I just talked to you about are true and accurate. If you sign the contract and then you learn the financials aren't true and accurate right before you're closing, well, that changes the deal. So long story short, this is really important. If you really want to get in the weeds with it, you can sort of cherry pick certain reps and warranties that I just mentioned and say, these are contingencies to the deal, but these ones aren't, if you really want to do that. But really a blanket contingency is probably the way to go. Purchase and sale case study number 6, I call the misguided. And this is where it's really critical to understand the restrictive covenant standard. So if I walk you through the story, again, we talked about what assets are being sold and what aren't, the purchase price, the AR involved in that. That's really important. The promises the parties are making to each other, the reps and warranties, the contingencies that the deal hinges on, and also just having that team is really important. Remember, having a team to surround you is critical. And then you're going to get to the non-compete. And of course, there are a lot of elements in between with these agreements. But again, we're teaching this to you in plain English so that you understand the foundations and the fundamentals that you're getting into. So the non-compete, this is the area where the seller tells the buyer, I am not going to compete with you because I just sold you the practice and I just sold you a bunch of goodwill in exchange for certain money. In exchange for that, I'm not going to compete with you. And what does that really entail? Well, typically it'll entail a radius of miles. Okay, and somewhere like Louisiana, it might be parish, but mostly it's a mile radius around the practice. It's usually as the crow flies. And it's also typically going to have a time parameter. And usually that time parameter is 3 to 5 years-ish in a sale of a practice. So why is it that you get into these deals and maybe the lender says they won't lend money unless there's a 3-year, 10-mile non-compete, when all these states seem to have different sayings about what is the law as far as non-competes are concerned? And the answer is, I don't know. And sometimes you have to work with the lender on that if that's the case. But the point being is that this changes from time to time depending on the state that you're in. So every state that you're in is going to have its own law concerning non-competes. Most states don't like to restrict parties from making a living, okay? And so most states, non-competes are actually not expressly permitted unless they fall under an exception. And typically an exception would be that goodwill is sold. So you can check that box typically in a sale, and that the scope of the parameters of the non-compete are reasonable. Now, again, this is just an example of what is the law in most states, but not in every state. And it's really important that you connect with your attorney, your teammate, to help you better understand what the non-compete is in that state that you're in. And so again, we're talking about scope being reasonable. So what is typically reasonable? Typically what reasonable is, it's the smallest parameter that can legitimately protect the buyer without prejudice to the seller. In English, again, that just means it's got to be reasonable. So it's sort of a balancing test. If the non-compete is the smallest that could protect the buyer, and usually that's maybe determined by where all the patients come from, mile radius wise, but it's prejudicial to the seller because the non-compete is 100, it's in rural Texas or something, and the non-compete is 100 miles, that still means that the seller might have to go drive 3 hours a day just to go work somewhere else. And who are we to say whether a seller who just took money doesn't need any more money and doesn't need to continue to work and make a living, right? Selling a practice doesn't just mean you're completely retiring. It could mean that you're moving, or that, well, moving would be a bad example because I'm giving the example of making the argument that you would have to move if, you know, we're going to have a 100-mile non-compete. But the point is that these non-competes have to meet that balancing test. And so, you know, forcing someone to drive 3 hours a day just to make a living, most states will frown upon that, but they will weigh all the factors, such as how much money you did take and a whole bunch of other things that are involved. But the point is the non-compete has to be reasonable, and it's got to be mostly reasonable in scope of time, which is usually 3 to 5 years, and miles. If you're doing this based on miles, which most states, that's how people do it. So what's misguided is that some lenders or some other parties to deals believe that they should just have a standard of a 3-year 10-mile non-compete or something like that. And that's just not the case. I've been asked so many times in my career, well, what's the standard non-compete? And the standard is whatever the law says in the state that you're in and the circumstance that you're in. If you're in Manhattan, and I had a client one time that was asked to have a 10-mile non-compete by a lender, and sounds like I'm knocking on lenders. I love lenders, but this is one area that I've always had some contention with. And they wanted a 10-mile non-compete in Manhattan. That just doesn't work, right? I mean, that's not feasible. Whereas a 10-mile non-compete in Dallas or something like that might be a little more feasible. So it's important to really check with your team and have a reasonable non-compete, because if it's not enforceable, number one, that's probably just going to cause issues between the parties, because when the seller realizes they got to drive 3 hours a day and it's not worth it, they're going to cause issue, and they may try to look into whether it's enforceable or not. And the last thing you want is any type of litigation or legal claims, transpiring after a sale occurs. So I think that, that's one thing to really take into consideration, is that if it's not enforceable, you could have that. And it's just overall time, money, and headaches. So we've talked about the associateship phase. We've talked about the phase of a purchase and going through that story, telling your story of the purchase and the asset purchase agreement. And now I want to talk to you about partnerships. Partnerships have a bad reputation, and I really don't know why, but I always hear that partnerships are destined to fail and these are like bad things. And that's just not the case, in my opinion. I think partnerships, in my opinion, generally work out. And most of my clients that are involved in partnerships have great partnerships that occur and long lasting. But I think what a lot of my clients do to make sure that happens is go through the proper steps and foundations and make sure that the situation is going to be a good one. And they sort of like go through the steps that I'll talk to you about. And that's what prevents them from issues down the road. So there are three primary goals with partnerships, okay? We've got getting into the deal, operating through the deal, and getting out of the deal. Pretty simple, pretty basic, pretty fundamental. We want to get in, we want to operate through, figure that out, and we want to figure out how to get out, okay? So let's talk about case study number one, which is the failed partnership. And getting into the deal is really what we talked about by telling that story with the purchase agreement. Getting into the deal is the buyer buys into the partnership. That's getting in, right? So now we're in the deal and we've got to govern how to work through it and then how to get out. And that's what these case studies are about. So case study number one is the failed partnership. And why did this particular partnership fail? Well, I often see partnerships fail because of personality, but it doesn't mean that's the only reason, even though it's probably the most common reason. And splitting the cost and splitting the money can be a big reason as to why a partnership doesn't work out. Why is that the case? It's because if you don't have a fair dynamic of how you're going to split the cost and the money, that's going to cause debate and it's going to cause issue and contention amongst the partners. So I came into a situation once where these current partners wanted resolution because each of them worked in the practice and they had a partnership agreement in place that was drafted to say that everything was split 50-50, meaning that the costs were going to be split 50-50 and meaning that the money was going to be split 50-50. Well, what's the inherent problem with that? The problem is that what happens if one doctor is producing more than the other doctor? Well, what ends up happening with that is the doctor who's producing more gets frustrated because they're producing more, yet they're making less. And then the doctor who's producing less is comfortable. They're not as motivated because they're producing less, yet they're making more. They're comfortable. So that obviously creates a situation that just does not work, because then the partnership fails because nobody's optimizing their potential. The overproducing doctor is not incentivized to continue to do that if they're making less. And the underproducing doctor is not incentivized to produce more because they're making more, yet they're not doing as much. That just doesn't work. You want to talk to your teammates, your CPAs, really important people to talk to when you structure how you're going to split the money and costs in a partnership, and determine what's going to be best fit for everybody. What I most commonly see that works is a hybrid of splitting some things based on ownership, but splitting other things based on production. I also, just as much as I don't see it working well for doctors to split everything 50-50, I just as much don't see it work well for doctors that split everything based on production, because that promotes almost like a more selfish mentality of being about yourself, because you're doing everything you can to produce as much as you can. And really the spirit of a partnership is to have sort of a rapport with everybody, and everybody has different strengths and everybody has different ways that they can have a partnership that might make things more equal, that might be the equalizer, but it might not show up exactly on the production or on the stat sheet, so to speak. And so I think it's really important to do that, and that hybrid model really helps. So for instance, an example of a hybrid model would be that the doctors maybe get paid a percentage of their collections or production off the top. Usually that's in the 25 to 35% range if it's a GP, higher often if it's a specialty practice. And then what they'll do is after they get paid that, they'll pay their costs, and then they will split everything from there based on ownership. That's something that I commonly see CPAs put together. Now, there are always exceptions. One exception would be if you're owning a practice, it's a complete investment and the doctors aren't working in that practice, then I think it's a bit more reasonable based on all the circumstances that you have to take into account to split everything 50-50, because nobody's working in the practice. This is more of an investment vehicle, but that would again be an exception. Partnership case study number 2 is the successful partnership. And that lesson that I want to teach is if there's a control debate, you can carve out unanimous decisions. So when you're making decisions in your partnership, and again, operating through the deal is really about splitting the costs and the money and management decision making. Management decisions are typically 50-50 if the partnership's 50-50, but they're not always that way if the dynamics are different and perhaps one partner owns 60 and one owns 40 or something like that. The traditional model is that whoever owns more gets the final say in decisions, right? Or if you have multiple doctors, 3, 4, 5 doctors in a practice, then you may be basing that on the majority of the doctors. And so the point is if that's the case, you still might want to provide some power to the minority doctors as well that carve out certain key items that still need to be unanimous despite most decisions being a majority based. And I'm going to explain what that means in a minute. But again, we've got the methodology of, hey, we're splitting all decisions based on ownership, and we happen to be 50-50, everything's equal. And we also have partnerships where it's not equal. It might be 60-40, 70-30, and they still do everything unanimously because they want everyone to feel like they're important in the deal. But in those where you are doing it that way and saying, hey, the majority is going to rule, and you're going to say, hey, we've got, either 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, or we've got 5 different doctors and however much the majority is going to rule, it still is a good idea, particularly if you are that minority doctor, to make sure that you have certain carve-outs in the documents that give you some sort of say in the most important things. I'm going to give you an example. So I'm in this transaction where it's really key that my doctor, who's the minority owner, they own 30%. Even though they don't get the majority decision-making, they still get to weigh in on taking on debt of the practice and signing personal guarantees. They don't want to have to be forced to sign a personal guarantee or sign on to debt because they were outvoted. Changing or amending the agreement. Well, that's huge. I mean, what good is it to sign an agreement when the next day certain partners can just change it? And then obviously that powerless party has nothing they can do about it. Another example would be making decisions to buy anything that's over $10,000 or $15,000. That provides some checks and balances and allows everyone to have a say in really largely material purchases. Those are just examples of where a doctor would want to have a say no matter what, or transferring ownership. accepting new partners into the practice. These major decisions are really important. Now, why is it beneficial to the majority that the minority have a say? Because the more involved everybody is and the more ownership everybody feels, the better and healthier the partnership's going to be, because everyone's going to be as motivated as possible. And that is the methodology and the model for the best possible partnership. I know if you're the majority holder, sometimes it's hard to grasp because you do want that control if you can. But if you've got a doctor who has no power, they're just not going to be as incentivized, and it's really not going to optimize the true spirit and success of the practice. Partnership case study number 3 is in the phase of getting out the deal and getting out of the deal and transferring ownership in the practice. So when you're going to get out of a deal, you've got to govern with your partners under what circumstances are we going to get out? Well, there's really 5 circumstances that I can think of. There's death, there's disability, there's disagreement, there is default by a doctor, and then there's just simply retirement or someone wants to transfer their interest, okay? But it's really important that you do this in a fair way. So I've got an example where I was drafting a partnership agreement for some doctors, and there was a massive debate in drafting this agreement over how they were going to govern the right of first refusal, which means that if one doctor wants to voluntarily transfer their interest, they can do so, but the argument was they have to be able to offer that interest to everybody else first that's already a partner. And I'm kind of focusing on this because death, disability are obviously sort of no-brainers that the person needs to sell, right? And then with respect to a disagreement, I'll touch on that, but that's often governed by what provisions of the contract say concerning disagreement. And then the other thing with respect to default is usually, a no-brainer that the person maybe lost their license or they committed a felony and they've got to be out. So really, I focus on voluntary transfer because this is the most common. So the problem in this deal that was happening was there was a right of first refusal situation where the doctor on one side wanted the right of first refusal if the other doctor wanted to sell out of the practice. But the problem was the doctor on the one side was saying, not only did they want right of first refusal, but they wanted to be able to have their cake and eat it too and block a sale to a third party if they didn't agree to buy the remainder of the interest. Well, why is that a problem? It's a problem because if the doctor has the right to purchase, but they don't, then they're restricting the marketability of the other doctor if they can block who that other doctor sells to. Now, their argument was, well, I got to work with this person. I'm the one staying, so I need to be able to have a say in who this person is. And I think there's a good argument to that. But if you're going to do that, I think you need to have a mandatory purchase dynamic in your agreement where if a doctor is going to sell, it's mandatory that the other doctor buy them out. Then they certainly have a say in who comes in and it becomes another partner if they're going to bring someone else in. And it also provides some relief to the doctor that's selling out because they know that they have a buyer. It's sometimes hard to go market to a random third party interest in a partnership. It's often acceptable if they're an associate in the practice. It's easier to kind of get them in because they're already there. But for someone who is not already in there, that's where it becomes more difficult because it's hard to market a random partnership interest in a partnership. It really usually has to come from within. So I'm a proponent and a fan of a mandatory purchase, but I'm also okay with the right of first refusal. You just can't have your cake and eat it too. And in this situation, the particular client wanted the right of first refusal and able to block the other doctor's sale if they wanted to sell, if they didn't like who they were selling to, and that just didn't work. Case study number 4, the death and disability dilemma. I'll briefly touch on this, and this is really just about using life or disability insurance. I'm a big proponent of using these if they're feasible and they're not cost prohibitive. Usually life insurance is not cost prohibitive, but disability insurance is. Why are these important? It's because if the premiums are not cost prohibitive, then you have the proceeds automatically in the unlikely event of a death or disability to then take them and buy out the deceased or the disabled doctor. You don't have to go to the well. You don't have to go to the bank and go get a loan to buy out that doctor, which even in partnerships where they have right of first refusal, oftentimes they'll have a mandatory purchase upon a death or upon a disability. So ultimately, no one wants to have to go take on more debt and get a loan from the bank or get loaned on a seller note from the estate of the decedent or from a disabled doctor. And they love being able to pull the proceeds and just go pay it. So I think that if you can make this situation feasible with life insurance or disability insurance, I would highly recommend it if it's not cost prohibitive. Breaking up is hard to do is case study number 5. And this is really just about breaking up. And there's really no magical solution to break up a partnership. I've seen time and time again, attorneys try to put clauses in contracts that say that, if one doctor, if there's a disagreement, one doctor gets one location, another doctor gets another, or, trying to pre-establish what's going to happen later. And the problem is, you don't know when a disagreement is going to happen, and hopefully it's never. But if it's 10 years from now, we don't know if it's fair that one doctor gets one certain practice and another gets another location, et cetera. We don't know what's going to be fair in the moment, and we don't want to predetermine or pre-establish that, because the whole goal is for it always to be fair. Even on a breakup, when the parties have the hardest time agreeing, it's still important to be fair, because if you're not fair, what's going to happen is you're going to trigger your dispute resolution provisions in your contract. And those dispute resolution provisions are going to call for arbitration or, any type of litigation. Those cost a ton of money. And remember, moral of the story, we're trying to save time, money, and headaches. Suing someone is time, money, and headaches. And most of the time that people sue each other and they get into, arbitration, whatever it is, they end up no better than they would have been if they just sat down at the table with their advisors and worked out something fair among all parties. So they end up spending $100,000 and they end up in a situation that's really no better than they would have had if they just were to cooperate and try to find a reasonable solution. That doesn't mean it's easy, but oftentimes it's better than spending tons of money. So I often like, instead of pre-establishing what's going to happen later, I often like having a simple dispute resolution provision, because the doctors are probably going to avoid, because they don't want to spend all the time and money and headaches. And so they'd rather come to the table and work it out. And I find that to be the best solution for the parties. So just to summarize the transition phase, and I apologize for keeping some of you late, and I am here to answer questions when we're done, but obviously we had the technical difficulty. We had the associate phase, we had the purchase and sale phase, and we had the partnership phase. In the associate phase, it's really important to protect the integrity of the practice and have an agreement and make sure that it's assignable and that you preserve the value of the practice with assignability of that contract, including non-compete and the confidentiality and the covenants that are in there. We've got the purchase and sale phase, which is really important to tell your story in the asset purchase agreement, govern what's being sold and what's not being sold, govern how the AR is going to be handled, what promises and reps and warranties the parties are making to each other, what contingencies, what does the deal hinge on, and the non-compete, making sure that that's fair, reasonable, and legally compliant. And then we've got the partnership phase, where it's also critical to have an agreement, and you really want to govern how you're operating through the deal with splitting costs and splitting the money, and how you're going to be governing decision-making. That's also going to be really critical. And we talked about some of the key elements of that and how important it is to have a team involved when you're doing that. And then finally, we also talked about getting out of the deal, and that's death, retirement, disability, disagreement, and default. And again, all those are unfortunate in ways you do not want out of the deal, except for the retirement part. And so it's really critical that you're governing fair ways to get out of the deal. And usually with disability and death, we're talking about life insurance and disability insurance potentially. And with a disagreement, we usually want the parties to come to the table to work out an equitable resolution and avoid major costs. And then with the other items, default, well, that's someone typically losing their license or committing a felony. And that's an area where the party does need to be kicked out typically to preserve the goodwill of the practice. And death, disability, disagreement, default, and then the retirement phase. It's just important to govern. Is it going to be a right of first refusal or not? If there is a right of first refusal, are you going to let the doctor that's staying still block it and have their cake and eat it too, which I don't really agree with? And those are the key elements there. So again, really my goal here today was to help you save time, money, and headaches. And, I created some headaches with connection problems, so I apologize for that, but I'm glad that I jumped back on, and I see that there are just as many participants here now as there were when we started this whole thing. And so I really, I highly appreciate it. And I really appreciate your time. My contact information is here. I'm really one that likes to give, and I'm happy to, if anybody has any questions, you want to shoot them to me via email, you can do that. You can also give me a ring. And, obviously I can't, thank MicroDental enough for helping me get involved with this. And I feel honored to be here. And also Modern Dental as well. Definitely want to thank both of them. This would never happen, obviously, without them. And I'm just highly appreciative to be a part of this. And I'm happy to stay and answer any questions that anybody has.
Speaking of that, we can begin our question and answer segment. Our first question we have coming in, David, are there any tips on mergers that you have for the audience?
Can you please restate that? I didn't quite hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any tips on mergers that you may have for the audience?
On mergers?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I think the biggest thing with the merger is to have your teammates involved, have that CPA involved where they can run the numbers. And if you're merging practices, the biggest thing is you've got to determine what the values are and if they're comparable. And if they're not comparable, then you've got to reconcile the numbers, and money's going to have to usually pass from one side to the other. The other critical item that a CPA is good to help with in a merger, where they can work alongside the attorney, is to structure the merger in a way that's most tax effective and efficient for the clients. Because anytime you merge, you may have to move some assets and things around, and you don't want to create tax events that are adverse. And so it's really critical for that reason to have that CPA involved, and also the lawyer involved, to know how you can arrange things and how you can set up companies and what you're able to do. Every state's different. For instance, a lot of doctors that merge and are partners in California, they can't be an LLC because you can't be an LLC in California and be a dental practice, whereas pretty much every other state you can. So one strategy in one state may not be the best strategy in another. And that's why it's really critical from a legal standpoint to have the lawyer involved, but also work in concert with the CPA. But again, merging is about creating, synergy between multiple practices. And to do that, you've got to move things around, and you've got to move money around to make sure that you're reconciling the numbers properly so that it's a fair deal.
Okay, sounds great. Our next question, what do you find to be the most commonly overlooked issue in a transition itself?
I think the most commonly overlooked issue in a transition is what I touched on with respect to preserving the value of the practice, and that is a non-compete with an associate, and how critical that is, and how you can be giving the associate complete power and control over your transaction. You run and own a dental practice, and your associate can be the determinant of whether or not you sell and what price you sell for potentially, if you don't have a contract with them and it's not assignable to a buyer of your practice. Another very commonly overlooked item in that same category is the non-compete being assignable when you're a buyer and you have a seller come and maybe work for you, or even if the seller's not going to work for you, they already gave you a non-compete in your purchase agreement. Is that assignable? What happens? Let's say you have a 5-year non-compete. What happens if, God forbid, you become disabled at year 2? You're gonna have to sell your practice. Well, a buyer is not going to come and want to buy the practice if your seller that you bought from, their non-compete is only with you and it can't be transferred or assigned over to another buyer of the practice who's buying your practice. And you never know what happens. During that non-compete period as a purchaser, you could have a change of heart, you could have family reasons as to why you have to maybe move and sell your practice, you could just decide that you get an offer you can't refuse, and so you sell your practice. Or again, like I mentioned, it could be, a situation where you become disabled, God forbid, or you pass away, God forbid. I'm on 2 deals now, unfortunately, where the sellers had passed away. So it makes life a lot easier on the estate of a decedent if they can just sell the practice, and obviously in that situation, because they're deceased, the buyer's not worried about them necessarily like coming back in and competing, but they also want to know. I mean, you never know. Sometimes there could be, I've had estates where there's people involved in the estates that are, DSO related, or even dentists. You just never know. So you want to make sure that it's assignable. But yeah, those are probably the most overlooked issues that I see.
Okay. Speaking of DSOs, we actually have another question coming in from Dr. Stephen. This is a long one. A DSO wants to pay me for my practice, more specifically for my patient charts, so that I can work for them. They have offered to pay a set amount per patient that comes to their practice where I would be employed. Is this typical? I feel that they should pay an amount for all active charts or an amount for all my active charts, plus a bonus if the patients come to their practice because I am there. I feel that we are both taking a certain amount of risk. Please advise.
Yeah, thank you so much for the detailed question there. There's a lot of detail there. That's awesome. The first thing that I would say is there are 2 things going on here. There's a business decision part of it, and there's a legal decision part of it. And the legal decision really comes down to, what does the law say in the state that you're in? Are you allowed to pay a doctor per patient that comes into the office? How can that be perceived? Is that even legal to do? So that's number one. That's the legal investigation that has to occur as to whether or not that's even allowed. Okay. Let's just assume it is, just for the purpose of going to the second layer of analysis. And that is the business decision. And that's a decision that you as a doctor have to make in terms of what type of leverage you have. And negotiation is about options. It's about leverage. And the more options you have, the more you can be flexible in sort of how hard you push versus how hard you don't push, based on, feeling out the situation. So if you're in a situation where it's difficult to sell your practice, you don't have a whole lot of other options, you may not be able to have the leverage to negotiate any other, dynamic in your deal. But if you have other options, you certainly can say that you're not willing to do the deal without some sort of lump sum of money involved. And all of that's really a moot point if the law doesn't permit it in the state that you're in.
Thank you for that detailed answer. Dr. Stephen, if you have any follow-up questions for that, since your question had some details in it, just let us know. Another question that we have coming in as well, sorry, this is a longer Q&A session. How important is it for a doctor to understand the legal agreement? This seems more of a general question.
Yeah, I think it's really important for the doctor to understand their legal agreement. I get this question all the time from clients of mine where they say, okay, how important is it for me to understand this? That's why I'm hiring you. Do I need to look at this thing? Do I need to read it? I don't think it's realistic for the doctor to read every single word of every single contract that's involved in the deal and understand every single, one of those. Now, obviously, you're going to have an attorney and they can help explain those things to you. But ultimately, I think it's important to, at a minimum, understand the foundations of the transaction. And I do think it's a mistake to not understand the fundamental aspects of your agreement. And that's what this lecture is all about today, is purchases and sales in plain English, so that you can understand the foundations of what you're getting into. So some of these things will be familiar to you as you see these contracts now, and you'll have a general understanding.
Okay. Let's see. So I believe we have one more question. What do you, excuse me, at what point in the deal should a lease assignment with a third-party landlord be addressed?
So that's a great question. That is often an area that's mishandled a lot in these transactions. And there's no perfect answer for that. And the question again was, when should a lease assignment in a deal, like for instance, you're a seller, you're selling your practice and a third-party landlord owns the practice, or you're a buyer buying and the third-party landlord owns the practice, or the building rather, the seller doesn't own the building. The answer is, if all things are perfect, you want to get the landlord involved ASAP, because they're the two biggest holdups in transactions are either financing, but most often assigning a lease, because most landlords have no financial incentive whatsoever to assign a lease. And so they're the last to approve of everything because it's just not a priority. So the sooner you can get them involved, absolutely the better. The issue is some sellers have a sensitive landlord-tenant situation and they don't want to involve the landlord yet until they know that they have a deal. I've had deals like that where my sellers know that telling the landlord they're trying to sell is going to ruffle a ton of feathers. And particularly those where that seller, their landlord is who they bought from to begin with. And their landlord's sort of territorial about the practice and all those kind of things. So they want to make darn sure that if they're going to talk to the landlord, they at least they know how the deal and they have the purchase agreement signed. Well, that's a tougher situation because that delays the deal. I told you that the landlord's the biggest holdup. If you go through the whole negotiation of the purchase and sale agreement, which can take several weeks, you finally get to a resolution. And then now you've got to fight the landlord battle that can take several more weeks. Now you're turning a deal that might have closed in 4 to 6 weeks into a deal that's going to close, could close into anywhere between 6 to 10 or more weeks. So there's no perfect answer. It's based on the situation, but if everything is ideal, I would do it as soon as possible.